New places, new perspectives, same questions, better answers. I'm Rowan Vale, and this is where learning becomes identity. Over the past 8 episodes, we've explored many of the ways that students develop during college. We've talked about identity, race, gender, sexuality, ways of knowing, meaning making, and personality. But today, we're exploring something that's often invisible, something that quietly shapes nearly every educational opportunity that a student encounters: social class. Most people think of social class simply as income, how much money someone has. But student development scholars argue that social class is much bigger than that. It's about power, resources, opportunity, expectations, and perhaps most importantly, the invisible rules students are expected to already know. Language learning offers a fascinating lens for thinking about social class because some of the richest developmental opportunities in higher education often require resources that many students simply don't have. Study abroad, language immersion, time, money, scheduling flexibility. None of these are distributed equally. So today we're asking, how does social class shape what a student becomes able to experience? Let's explore. Let's begin by talking about maybe the not so obvious fact that social class is more than money. When we hear the phrase social class, most of us immediately think about income. But our readings challenge that assumption. Social class certainly includes economic resources, yet it also includes social relationships, cultural expectations, educational experiences, and access to power. Rather than being only an objective measure like household income, social class reflects a person's lived experiences within broader systems of privilege and inequality. Two students might report similar family incomes, yet one may have parents who attended college, knows professors personally, understands financial aid, and have professional networks. Another may not have any of those advantages. Financially, they might appear similar. Socially, their college experiences may be completely different. This becomes especially important when we think about language learning. It's easy to assume that students simply choose whether to study another language, but choice itself is shaped by opportunity. Can a student afford an unpaid study abroad experience? Can they delay graduation for another semester of language study? Can they work fewer hours to attend conversation roundtables? Opportunity is rarely just about motivation. Sometimes it's about resources. One of the more resonant ideas that I'd like to talk about today is the idea of the hidden curriculum. One of the more interesting ideas from this week's readings is that colleges themselves often reflect middle class values. Many of the expectations students encounter are never formally taught. Students are simply expected to know them: how to network, how to speak with professors, how office hours work, how internships lead to careers, how to ask for recommendation letters, or how to navigate study abroad. These invisible expectations are sometimes called the hidden curriculum. Students whose families have already navigated higher education often arrive already familiar with these unwritten rules. First generation students may be just as capable academically, but they're learning the hidden curriculum while simultaneously learning chemistry, history, or Japanese. I've often thought language learning has its own hidden curriculum. Students don't simply learn grammar, they learn how to study, how to tolerate mistakes, how to seek conversation partners, how to navigate cultural discomfort. Those lessons are rarely listed in the syllabus. They often determine who can persist in language study. All of this leads us to the idea that cultural capital travels too. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu introduced the idea of cultural capital. Not all valuable resources are financial. Sometimes the most valuable resources are knowledge, habits, relationships, and familiarity with institutions. Dr. Bray's lecture expands this idea through the social class worldview model, explaining that people develop different lenses for understanding class based on economic culture, worldview, and experiences with classism. These lenses influence what feels normal, what feels valuable, and what feels attainable. Let's think about study abroad. Some students grow up hearing stories from parents who studied overseas. Travel feels normal, expected, almost inevitable. Other students may never have known someone who owned a passport. The opportunity feels distant, maybe even unrealistic. Neither student is more intelligent, but one enters college already believing that a global learning is for people like me. The other may not. Sometimes our biggest barriers aren't our abilities, they're our imaginations. All right, we've spent the last few minutes talking about social class from the perspective of researchers and student development theory. But theory becomes much more meaningful when we hear how students actually experience it. So today, I'm joined by one of my classmates who has generously agreed to share a few of her reflections from her own educational journey. Let's welcome Chantel.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, thanks so much for joining me, Chantel.
Thank you for having me.
The first question that I have for you today is looking back on your college journey, what's something you now realize was influenced by social class that you didn't recognize at the time?
Looking back on my college journey, I realized that many of the opportunities and experiences students have are shaped by their social class, even when those differences are not immediately obvious. One thing I did not recognize at first was how much prior knowledge, resources, and support systems influences students' abilities to navigate college successfully. So, some students enter college already knowing how to communicate with professors, applying for internships, seeking professional opportunities, and understand the unwritten expectation of higher education because they have family members or mentors who have gone through the process before. I also became more aware of of how financial resources impacted students' experience. Things like being able to participate in unpaid internships, studying abroad opportunities, joining organizations like fraternity and Greek life that require fees, or even having extra time outside of work commitments can create advantages that are not always visible. And at the time, I viewed these differences as individual choices, but now I understand that many of those choices were influenced by students' access to resources.
That's a very perceptive take on social class. Was there a particular moment, and I know you listed off several, but was there one that really made you aware of those differences?
Yeah, there was a moment that made me more aware of these differences, especially when it came to opportunities like internships and leadership roles, as well as networking. Some students seem to know exactly what steps to take because they have been exposed to those conversations before college.
Right.
An example I had that I could think off the top of my head was a fellow peer of mine getting an internship at a very prestigious hotel company because her family was already a member of their attached country club, as well as knowing the general manager of the hotel.
Right.
So it became very clear that success in college was not only about motivation or hard work, but also about understanding the systems and having access to the right information at the right time.
Yes, very much. All right. The next question is, have there ever been any hidden rules in higher education that you felt you have had to learn on your own?
Yeah, so there were many hidden rules that I have learned through experience rather than through direct instruction. So, one major hidden rule was understanding how to advocate for myself. I had to learn that asking questions, attending those office hours, building relationships with my teachers and faculty as well, and seeking mentorships were not signs that I was struggling, but actually strategies using to be more of a successful student.
Hmm.
So another hidden rule I would say was learning how to navigate professional spaces as well. Things like knowing how to write professional emails,
Oh,
introduce myself in networking settings, applying for opportunities, or talking about my accomplishments were skills that some students seem to have already understand. I had to intentionally learn those skills over time, and I also learned that knowing where to find resources was just as important as the resources themselves. And colleges often provide many support services like our career center here at UA, but students may not know they exist unless someone guides them toward them.
absolutely. All right, Chantel. The last question that we have for you this afternoon is if colleges could change one thing to better support students from different social class backgrounds, what would you want educators to understand?
I would want educators to understand that students entering college on different levels of preparations, as well as knowing resources and knowledge about how higher education works. A student's ability to navigate college should not depend on whether they already know the rules of the game. And so, one important change would be making expectations and resources more transparent. Colleges should intentionally teach students how to navigate academic, professional, and social systems rather than assuming everyone already understands them. This could include some like strong first year programs, mentorship opportunities, financial education courses, career preparation, as well as intentional conversations about the hidden curriculum of higher education. And so ultimately, educators should recognize that supporting students means addressing not only academic needs, but also the social and cultural understanding students need to feel confident and successful within themselves. And students should not have to struggle to discover information that could have been provided to them from the beginning.
I really appreciate you sharing that. One thing that I often notice in conversations is that students rarely lack motivation. It's usually sometimes they don't have the access to the information that they need.
Yeah,
Cool. Thanks so much for being with us today, Chantel.
no problem. Thanks again for having me.
All right. See you later.
See ya.
All right. Let's wrap up today like we always do by thinking about what institutions can do. One message appears throughout this week's readings. Colleges do not simply educate students, they also reproduce or challenge social inequality. Institutions often normalize middle class values and that students from working class backgrounds may experience a cultural mismatch between their own experiences and campus expectations. That means institutions matter. Language departments can schedule courses in ways that fit working students. Scholarships can support study abroad. Faculty can explain expectations that other students may have learned at home. Advisors can help students see possibilities they hadn't imagined. And perhaps most importantly, we can stop assuming that every student begins from the same starting line. I've come to believe that one of the greatest gifts higher education can offer isn't simply knowledge, it's possibility. Sometimes students don't need someone to tell them that they belong. They need someone to show them that opportunities that they once thought were reserved for someone else were always meant for them too. All right, next time we're going to wrap up this series by talking about disability identities and development. Social class reminds us that student development is never simply about individual effort. Students develop within environments, within systems, within opportunities that are not equally distributed. As educators, understanding those differences doesn't lower expectations. It helps us remove unnecessary barriers so more students have opportunities to thrive. So next time, we'll conclude this series by exploring another dimension of identity that higher education is still continuing to better understand. We'll examine disability identity and development. We'll ask how colleges can move beyond accommodation toward genuine inclusion. And we'll consider what accessibility teaches us about designing learning environments where every student has the opportunity to not simply participate, but to flourish. I'm Rowan Vale, and remember, learning another language doesn't simply change how you speak. It changes how you see the world. And sometimes it changes who gets to see themselves in it. So until next time, stay curious about who you're becoming.